At 6:40 in the morning, Marcel Dubois turned the iron key in the side gate of Père Lachaise cemetery, expecting a quiet Thursday. By 9 o'clock, traffic had stopped moving across 4 arrondissements of Paris, and Marcel, 22 years old, 11 months into the only job he had ever held, was pressed flat against the cemetery wall by a crowd he could not see the end of. October 10th, 1963, Boulevard de Ménilmontant, 20th arrondissement, Paris. Marcel had been told to expect a modest ceremony. His supervisor, Monsieur Fontaine, had said as much the night before. Some family, some old friends from the music halls, nothing like the Sarah Bernhardt crowds. Have the small gate ready by 8. Marcel had nodded, locked up, and gone home to the room he rented 2 streets away, where his mother still kept a scratched 78 of La Vie en Rose on the shelf above the stove. He did not know yet that the woman being buried that morning had grown up singing on pavements not unlike the one he swept every evening. He did not know that by the time the hearse reached the cemetery gates, more people would be standing between here and the Bastille than had voted in the last arrondissement election. He only knew that at 6:40 the street outside was empty, and that by 9 it was not empty anywhere in Paris. Something was happening that no one at the cemetery office had planned for, and Marcel, third from the bottom in seniority, holder of the smallest key, was the first man from Père Lachaise to see it coming. 3 days earlier, on the night of October 7th, a black citoyenne had left a villa above Grasse in the hills of the French Riviera and driven north through the dark for 11 straight hours. Edith Piaf had died there that morning, in the south, at the age of 47, the woman who had sung for kings and dock workers, who had turned a Belleville street voice into La Vie en Rose and Hymne à l'amour, and, 3 years earlier, into the song that had saved a bankrupt Paris theater. Non, je ne regrette rien. Her manager, Loulou Barricade, gave the order himself. Piaf would not be announced as having died in the south of France. She would be presented to the world as having died in Paris, in her own apartment on Boulevard Lannes, the city that had made her and that she had never really left in the stories she told about herself. She belongs to Paris, Barricade reportedly told the small circle who arranged it. Paris will not accept anything else. So the car came north through the night, past Lyon, past Fontainebleau, carrying a woman the newspapers would say, the next morning, had died among her people. It was not exactly true. It was, everyone in that car understood, the only version of the truth that Paris would forgive. Piaf had spent nearly 3 decades building the story Barrier was now protecting. A child of the Belleville pavements, born Edith Giovanna Gassion in December 1915, she had been discovered singing for coins on a Pigalle sidewalk by a cabaret owner who changed her name to La Môme Piaf, the Sparrow. She had written La Vie en Rose herself in 1946. She had buried a fiancé, the boxer Marcel Cerdan, after his plane went down over the Atlantic in 1949, and sung again the same night rather than cancel a show. She had carried Charles Aznavour's suitcases up the same stairs he would later carry his own gold records up. And she had stood in the wings of the Moulin Rouge, teaching a young Yves Montand how to hold a room. 3 years before her death, she had walked onto the stage of a bankrupt Olympia theater and, with one song, kept its doors open for another generation. None of that history was in Marcel's head yet. He was asleep in his rented room while the Citroën crossed into the city limits at dawn on October 9th, 1 full day before he unlocked the gate. The Archdiocese of Paris said no. Edith Piaf, twice divorced, her private life picked over for 2 decades by newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, would not receive a requiem mass at a Catholic church. No high altar, no bells from Notre Dame. The Archbishop's office made the decision quietly, and it reached the public within a day. Marcel heard it on the cemetery office radio, hunched over a cup of chicory coffee with 2 other groundskeepers. "No church service," the announcer said. "The funeral procession will proceed directly to Père Lachaise." One of the older groundskeepers, a man named Albert, who had worked the cemetery for 30 years, shook his head. "Then it will be small," Albert said. "No mass, no cathedral crowd. Family, a few singers, done by noon." Marcel didn't answer. He was thinking of his mother's record, of a woman's voice that had somehow made its way from a Belleville sidewalk into his mother's kitchen, and 100,000 kitchens like it, without ever needing a cathedral to do it. "We'll still want the small gate ready," Monsieur Fontaine said, passing behind them. 8 o'clock sharp." Marcel said, "Yes, monsieur." He did not yet know how wrong all 3 of them were. The first barricade went up at 7, 200 meters from the cemetery's main entrance. By 7:40, it had buckled under the weight of people leaning against it just to see the hearse route. Not one barricade, 2 more went up behind it. By 8:15, all 3 had given way, not broken, not stormed, simply absorbed, the way a small dam disappears under a rising river. The police captain on duty radioed for reinforcements at 8:30. By 9, he was radioing for reinforcements for the reinforcements. "How many?" Marcel asked one of the mounted police officers holding the cemetery's side approach. The officer didn't look at him. "They told us to expect 5,000, he said. "We stopped counting past 40. It kept climbing. Some estimates that week would put it at 100,000. Some newspapers, trying to describe a number no one had actually measured, simply wrote that traffic had stopped moving in every direction for as far as a person could see from a rooftop on Boulevard de Ménilmontant. Then came the second shock. A groundskeeper ran in from the office at 9:15, breathless, holding a transistor radio to his ear. Jean Cocteau, the poet, the filmmaker, Piaf's old friend from 3 decades of Paris nightlife, had collapsed and died that same morning, hours after hearing the news of her death on his own radio. "Both of them," Albert said quietly, "in one day." Marcel said nothing. He gripped the gate handle and watched the street fill in from both ends at once. At 10:52 a.m., the hearse turned onto Boulevard de Ménilmontant, and the crowd did something no police captain, no cemetery official, and no newspaper the following morning fully explained. It began to sing. Not one voice, not 100, a wave of it, rolling down the boulevard ahead of the hearse itself, as if the street were singing the car toward its destination, rather than the other way around. Fishmongers still in their aprons, war veterans with medals pinned crooked to old coats, taxi drivers who had abandoned their cars in the gridlock and climbed onto the hoods to see. They were singing "Non, je ne regrette rien," the song about regretting nothing, about setting fire to the past and starting again, to a hearse carrying the woman who had first stood alone under one spotlight and sung it into history. Marcel stood at the small gate, the one Monsieur Fontaine had told him to have ready by 8, and he did not open it right away. He couldn't. His hands had stopped answering him. "She sang on streets exactly like this one," Albert said, standing beside him now, his voice unsteady in a way Marcel had never heard from him. "She's just letting them sing back." That's when it happened. The moment Marcel would describe for the rest of his working life at Père Lachaise, as the instant he understood what his job actually was. He turned the key. He pulled the gate open. And 100,000 people who had never met Edith Piaf walked her home, singing her own words back to her. The burial itself took 11 minutes. No mass, no cardinal, no cathedral bells, exactly as the Archdiocese had ruled. Just a graveside service, a handful of formal words, and a silence that Marcel said afterward felt heavier than any of the singing had. Théo Sarapo, her husband, stood closest to the grave. Charles Aznavour was there, and so were dozens of performers whose careers she had helped build from nothing, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had walked from Belleville and Ménilmontant on foot because the metro platforms were too full to move. Telegrams arrived at the cemetery office for days afterward, forwarded on from Piaf's apartment, one from Marlene Dietrich in the United States, who had held Piaf's trembling hands backstage in New York years before, and now could not be there to hold them a last time. Yves Montand sent word from a film set he could not leave. Aznavour needed no telegram. He had walked behind the coffin himself. One more debt paid to the woman who had once told a frightened young man to change his face and never once his voice. By 1 in the afternoon, the crowd outside the cemetery gates still had not fully dispersed. Marcel spent the rest of the day answering the same question over and over from people who had missed the burial itself and simply wanted to know one thing: which way to the grave? He walked the last group there himself, past 6 o'clock, after his shift should have ended. An elderly woman in the group stopped at the fresh earth, crossed herself, and said, to no one in particular, she never forgot where she came from. That's why we came. Marcel didn't have an answer for that. He didn't think one was needed. 6 months later, Marcel Dubois was no longer the youngest gatekeeper at Père Lachaise. Monsieur Fontaine had retired that spring, and Marcel, 23 now, and the only man on staff who had personally walked 100,000 mourners through that gate, had been given the keys to all of it. The path to Piaf's grave had already worn a visible groove into the gravel, a little wider each month from the sheer number of feet that walked it. Visitors left things: a single rose, more often than a bouquet, ticket stubs from Olympia shows decades old, handwritten notes folded small enough to tuck between the stones. Marcel cleared them every few days, the way he'd once been told to clear ordinary debris from ordinary graves. He stopped thinking of it as debris within the first week. Tour guides began bringing groups by within the year. American visitors mostly, some who barely knew a word of French, but knew every syllable of La Vie en Rose. Marcel learned to recognize the look on their faces before they even reached the grave. The searching, disbelieving look of people who had crossed an ocean for a woman who had once sung for coins on a Pigalle sidewalk not 2 miles from where she now rested. He still swept that gate every evening. Some habits, he found, a person doesn't retire from. Père Lachaise Cemetery still receives more visitors to one grave than to almost any other resting place in Paris. More, some years, than to Chopin's, more than to Oscar Wilde's, both buried within a few hundred meters of her. Fresh flowers appear at Edith Piaf's headstone most weeks of the year, left by people who were not yet born on October 10, 1963. Marcel Dubois worked at Père Lachaise for the next 41 years. In an interview recorded late in his life, An elderly man with a groundskeeper's stooped shoulders was asked what he remembered most about that October morning. He didn't describe the size of the crowd, or the barricades, or the 11 minutes of silence at the grave. "I remember the singing," he said. "I opened one small gate, expecting almost no one, and a whole city walked through it, singing her back to her." He paused, the way people do when a memory has outlasted the need to explain it. "That's the part they never put in the newspapers," he said. "Not that she died, that she never actually left." Somewhere in Paris, on any given evening, a radio still plays 4 notes that everyone recognizes before the 5th one arrives. The gate closes at dusk. The path to her grave stays worn all the same, 100,000 footsteps deep, and still being walked. Have you ever stood in a crowd that began singing together, unplanned, the way Paris did for Edith Piaf on the day of her funeral? Tell us about it in the comments below, and subscribe for more untold stories from the world of Paris Chanson.